My name is Elizabeth Cousens. I'm the Deputy CEO of the United Nations Foundation, and I'm absolutely delighted to have the opportunity to moderate this opening panel and try to set a bit of the table for the rest of the day. The panel is called New Momentum and Opportunities for Tackling Climate Change, and features three individuals who have shown real leadership in rallying to the urgency of climate action, and who have done so with savvy and a deep understanding of the economic, political, and diplomatic drivers of change. Some of us were at a dinner last night, and we spoke about two accelerations. We talked on the one hand about the acceleration of climate impacts, all the things that Rosina just laid out so forcefully. At the same time, we talked about, in parallel, the acceleration of climate action, and Rosina also spoke to that, among governments, cities, citizens, consumers, and businesses and investors, importantly. And that's really what we're here especially to discuss today. So let me briefly introduce our three panelists, and I'll be brief because they are already very well known, I think, to all of you. Brian Deese, at the end of the row, is Global Head of Sustainable Investing for BlackRock. He was President Obama's top advisor on domestic and international climate and energy issues. Welcome, Brian. François Delattre, to my right, is France's permanent representative to the United Nations here in New York. He was previously the French ambassador to the US in Washington, and his time in both of those posts, interestingly, corresponded with the ascendance of French leadership in the climate arena, including, obviously, the Paris Agreement itself. Welcome. And last but not least, Patricia Espinosa is the Executive Secretary of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. She is in charge of all international climate negotiations and landing them there for the UN at successive COPs and more broadly on the global stage. She was also Mexico's former foreign minister, among many other esteemed roles. So I'm going to start by posing a question to each of the panelists, and then we'll try to get a little bit of a conversation going. And Brian, let me start first with you. A few weeks ago, Larry Fink, your chairman and CEO, created quite a buzz that will have been heard in this room with his powerful call for corporate purpose and long-term value creation in his annual letter to leading CEOs. And he wrote, among other things, without a sense of purpose, no company, either public or private, can achieve its full potential, and it will ultimately lose the license to operate from key stakeholders. That's a powerful line. How do you understand this call for action in the climate context in particular, and what does it mean in practical terms for people in this room?
Well, thank you, and it's a pleasure to be here at this conference with so many friendly faces and on an issue that is so timely and important. I'm glad you started with the letter and that statement in particular, and I'd like to answer your question by trying to actually start from helping to explain what's behind that sentiment. I think that for those of you who haven't had the chance to read the letter, the goal was to make an argument that said that defining a social purpose was actually key to companies succeeding in the changing world that we operate in today. That insight is grounded in a fiduciary mindset. First and foremost, from BlackRock's perspective, our focus is on enhancing return. And when you think about that from a fiduciary mindset, the definition of social purpose, and including, if you read the letter, there was also very clear language about companies' management of environmental, social, and governance issues, both as opportunities and managing risks, was associated with their performance over time. That in some ways that is a provocative idea, but in some ways it is quite an intuitive idea from an investing standpoint. That those companies that are addressing humanity's biggest challenge are often well-positioned to grow and compete and meet the increasing demands of consumers, stakeholders, and communities about their expectations of how companies operate. So the letter was grounded in that fiduciary mindset that we at BlackRock approach all of our work in. And I think that insight is is at the core of how we think about sustainable investing and how we get to the answer to the question that you posed. I'd like to just be provocative on the panel by trying to actually provide a definition of sustainable investing, because we talk a lot about this in different forums. And, I would proffer that if you think about the sentiment behind Larry's letter, sustainable investing is when you combine a traditional investment approach with an insight about the environment, about society or governance, in an effort to try to mitigate risk or enhance long-term return. And all three parts of that are important. First, a traditional investment approach. This is not a peripheral exercise. This is the idea that those companies that are best positioned to address central issues can actually outperform over time is core to the investment process. It is about insights. It's about trying to use data to identify insights about the environment, about human capital, about governance that actually are not captured in traditional financial analysis. And at the end of the day, it is about mitigating risk or enhancing return. And if we can get that right, then we can create investment opportunities that can reach enormous scale. And I think that, I remember with some of you and many of us, when we were in Paris and we were talking about the negotiating framework, there was a deep underlying question of, if we could put a framework in place, however imperfect it would be, could it create a context in which private capital could actually come and help play a role in saving the world? And I think that it is in that way that I just described that you can find a way to the answer to that being yes. So to the application to climate change. I think from our perspective, I think it has a couple of important implications. The first is that as investors, you can no longer ignore climate change. I think it's safe to say that if you're not a climate-aware investor, then you're fundamentally not doing your job. That's true because of the wide array of risks that we just heard about, be they physical or regulatory. It's also true because of emerging evidence about the performance of companies over time. And I think we are at a moment where the proliferation of data is actually allowing for much more textured assessment about those companies that actually effectively manage climate-related risks, manage the way in which they utilize energy, actually outperform over time. Now, there's lots of questions about how to measure that over duration and time frame, what the actual causation stream is, whether it's about operational improvement or mitigating risk. All those questions are important for investors to sort out. But at base, you have to be climate aware. The second for us at BlackRock is embedding those insights and that approach within all of our investment processes. And so with respect to our actively managed portfolios, that involves a process of integrating those insights into everything that we do and the way that we look at any potential investment. With respect to our index portfolios, where we hold where we own the index, it means engaging with companies where there is a material risk or a material opportunity. And just for example, in December, we sent a letter to 120 companies in relevant industries, asking them for their input on what they are doing to respond to the TCFD's recommendations around climate disclosure. And I think that leads me to the last thing about what it means for us, which is it means pushing for better data and greater disclosure. I think we're at an enormous fulcrum point in this space right now. It's extraordinary if you think about the fact that 80% of the data in the world has been created over the last 2 years. And that will only increase geometrically over time. That creates huge opportunity, but it also creates enormous challenges. And we need not only more data, but better standardized disclosure to allow investors to actually identify those insights that will actually be sources of risk and opportunity in the future.
Thank you, Brian. Let me go next to Ambassador Delattre, François. France has played a major leadership role in the climate arena, especially in recent years. And in December, President Macron made finance the centerpiece of his One Planet Summit on climate change that brought leaders from the UN, from governments, and from the private sector alike. Can you say a bit about why finance was the first issue up for you under his presidency, and kind of how you see the kind of reflections that you just heard from Brian and the role that governments especially can play in accelerating some of those dynamics? Thank you.
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth, and many thanks to CIRIS and the UN Foundation for their extraordinary commitment. It's a great honor for me as the French ambassador to the UN to be invited at the Investor Summit on Climate Risk and speak before such a distinguished audience. I must congratulate you all for this exceptional turnout of international investors, companies, experts, and thought leaders. This is really impressive. I was already France's permanent representative to the UN during the COP21, and as many here in the room, active in the Paris Accord negotiations. Never in my diplomatic career have I witnessed or felt so much hope and momentum that I did then as I do now. The COP21 was perhaps so transformative because it brought together historical participants, state and non-state actors, but also reached out to new participants, the business community and investors. In my experience, the level of participation of businesses and investors was unprecedented. Both President Hollande and then President Macron know that the Paris Accord's success to transition to a low-carbon economy needs the money to follow the intent. There is simply no other way. And that is why President Macron launched the One Planet Summit, and why we are all here today. We urgently need to scale up all efforts, and particularly the funding, to achieve our goals, the goals we set ourselves under the Paris Agreement. President Macron's immensely successful initiative to host the One Planet Summit, co-organized with the UN Secretary General and the President of the World Bank, showed beyond the shadow of a doubt that the Paris Agreement is here to stay. The summit's extraordinary attendance and the series of announcements and commitments made, released almost hourly during the two-day summit, conveyed to the world a message of urgency from many in the global investment community that really stepped up to say it was ready to do its part. And this, of course, is immensely important. The One Planet Summit, which will be an annual event, showed that when we all come together, we can really make change. Another result of the One Planet Summit is the indispensable discussions at COP23 as developing nations want to make sure that we, the industrialized nations, adequately support adaptation and mitigation measures in the most vulnerable regions of the world. That support cannot be done without money. By putting finance at the center of the summit, indeed, as you said, Elizabeth, President Macron sent a strong signal. If the Paris Accord is to succeed, we need to bring those who can fund the transition to the table. I will not list the many commitments, more than a dozen, nor projects showcased, about 20, that illustrate how local and global solutions are being found. I can only conclude that we have left the era of words and moved to the era of action. I want to highlight very briefly, no worry, 3 important threads that we all observed at the summit. Number 1, growing market and regulatory pressure on companies to disclose their carbon exposure and transition plans to a low-carbon economy. Let me mention the Climate Action 100+ that was announced at the summit by Comptroller Betty Yee, who is here with us today. I had the privilege of witnessing this initiative in the making back in 2016. In the course of the many private meetings I hosted at the French mission of the UN with some of the world's largest international investors. Here I want to pay a special tribute, actually, to California State Controller Betty Yee, New York State Controller Tom DiNapoli, and New York City Controller Scott Stringer. I have worked closely with them and their teams since 2016 and thank them for their support. At the summit, a growing number of investors and companies also announced their support for the TCFD, which is shared by Mike Bloomberg, who we all know is a true friend of the UN, and if I may say also a true friend of France. Second trend, number 2, more de-risking and scaling up of low-carbon investments around the world. And third trend, growing efforts to incorporate climate change in all sectors of the economy. Of course, we will have to ensure that the commitments made at the One Planet Summit are kept. A coalition, the One Planet Coalition, was formed in order precisely to do this, to follow up on their implementation. In short, I'm even more optimistic today than I was when I spent those sleepless nights in Paris at the negotiating table. Getting 193 countries to agree was step 1. We accomplished that. Getting markets and businesses to support the transition to a low-carbon economy is step 2. And the One Planet Summit showed us that we are well on our way there. So my warmer thanks to all of you. Merci. Thank you.
I want to thank you also for mentioning adaptation, which I think too often gets lost in conversations like this, and I hope over the course of the day people will find ways to come back to that extremely large agenda. I want to turn next to Secretary Espinosa. Patricia, you are a singular voice with a singular role on these issues. You're the person at the UN whose job it is to keep the Paris Agreement on track during this critical early phase of building momentum and being able to show that momentum is there, even if there are some deviations from the course we have been on. How do you see these different trends, and what role do you see from your perch, the investor community and the business community being able to play in helping you with the political track that you are trying to keep us so forcefully on?
Thank you. Thank you, Elizabeth. First of all, I want to say that I'm really very, very excited to see such an incredible group of people, investors, representatives from financial community, experts, leaders, gathered here at the United Nations to work together with the United Nations on an agenda that has really been qualified as the most relevant for the future of humanity. So thank you for being here. It's really an indication of that the transformation that we need to see, not only here in New York, but everywhere in the world, is starting to happen. Regarding your question, Elizabeth, I would like to start also by saying that this is going to be a very critical year in the negotiations. By December this year at COP24 in Poland, we need to finalize what we call in the process the Paris Agreement Work Program, which is the operating manual for the Paris Agreement, making it operational. We have a framework. The Paris Agreement is a fantastic framework. It really guides the process not only on climate change, I would say in general on development. And I have referred to this year as Paris 2.0 because without having a good outcome this year, Paris will remain being just an agreement. We need this result this year to be able to implement it. So in order to be successful in that, we really need to build trust among parties. And one very important element to build the trust among parties is financing. Governments need to know that the financing element, if they really engage into implementing the Paris Agreement, is going to be delivered. And they also know that it is not only public money. It is going to be really and mainly money that needs to be mobilized from the financial community, from the investors, from businesses. So there is a really major role that the financial community, all of you, can play in building up that trust. And what we are seeing is a kind of disconnect between what is happening in the negotiations, in many of the discussions in the negotiations, and the exciting things and the exciting direction that so many businesses and so many investors are taking in the real world. So this is where we feel we can play a role. This is what the Deputy Secretary General was mentioning when she was saying, yes, we can convene all of you. We can also share with you our expertise and our knowledge of what is needed. But we need to make that connection between this world that is already doing the changes and the negotiations and the people that are taking the decisions in terms of what commitments they will be willing to take in regarding implementing Paris. And it's really, this is the fundamental issue. If there's one single fundamental issue that will make it possible, it's the financial resources. So please do go to your colleagues in the places where you operate. Try to reach out to those that are involved in these agendas and that may not know, actually, in many cases it's true, may not know of the many, many initiatives and many changes that you are introducing in the way you do business, in the way you assess risks, in the way that you are looking at sustainable investments into the future. I think that's really a very important role. And we have a very good opportunity also this year because we will have an exercise, the first preliminary assessment of where we stand through something that is called the Talanoa Dialogue. So we have put together an online platform so that everybody can contribute with their ideas, with their stories, with their success stories, and with their, also maybe with the examples of things that have not worked. So I do encourage you all also to contribute to that conversation that will be taking place throughout the year and should be culminating at the COP in Poland in December with a high-level political discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia. And thank you. Our time is short, as always is the case, but I want to try for one round of a couple of rounds of queries. So first, to pick up on, I think, your very helpful laying out of so much that is happening. All of you have spoken about how much is happening in different domains and arenas, and yet sometimes there are disconnects. Do you have thoughts about some of the most productive ways to do more, to really bring these different worlds together, to get more visibility in the right places for the kind of action that is happening and that can try to build confidence, whether it's confidence among political elites, confidence among consumers, shareholders, et cetera? I want to turn maybe first, Brian, to you, but then to you all on that point. What more can we do?
Secretary Espinosa will have a better visibility into what's going to be the most useful in the context of the negotiations. I guess I would say three things really quickly. One is I think that when we think about finance and finance's role in contributing to the framework that Paris laid out, I do think that we risk a bit of announcement fatigue. That there is so much going on, and that there has been so much activity. But I think increasingly, as the parties go into the negotiations and move into this next phase, the focus is increasingly going to be on action and flows and outcomes. And so I think that that's one way in which I think orienting around those concrete outcomes is going to be important. The second, I think, is it goes to an issue that I think a number of us touched on initially, is figuring out ways to harness data, to drive additional disclosure, and then build that into greater capabilities to actually model and demonstrate the risks and opportunities associated with the transition to a low-carbon economy is both an area where we need to get better, but also if we do, I think the opportunity to demonstrate concrete progress is huge. Because there is from an investor standpoint and from an asset owner standpoint, there's an important initial question about knowing what you own and understanding the risks associated with the portfolio that you own. And risks not just in a static sense, but in a dynamic sense over time. And so the conversation that will happen in this, in this forum across the course of the day on some of the specifics around that I think are very important, but in terms of building trust and building confidence, I think that that's important. And the last thing I'll say just very briefly is, and this is just, there's a much broader observation, is that I think that we all understand and have absorbed the importance of presentations like the one we just saw about the magnitude of the risk and the magnitude of the challenge. But I think it is also, in terms of building confidence, important to reflect on the topic, momentum, that was in the title of this conversation. And as I reflect back, and this forum is causing me to reflect a bit, that if you think about both market momentum and diplomatic momentum, 5 years ago, when the U.S. and China started a conversation, the dominant expectation was that the U.S. and China could not come together and jointly set targets around climate. 3 years ago, when we got on a plane to go to India to see Prime Minister Modi, and he set a goal of 100 gigawatts of solar, the dominant expectation was, by 2022, the dominant expectation was that that was not a goal that was remotely in sight. 2 years ago, when many of us were coming off of the back of the Paris Agreement, the dominant expectation was that for the Paris Agreement to get entered into force, it would be years into the future. And 1 year ago, the dominant expectation was that the business community in the United States and state and local governments there'd be big questions about whether and to what degree they would directionally point to where they intended to go on this issue. So I do think it's important also, in terms of figuring out how to build trust, to reflect on that momentum and as complicated as the task is in the negotiations, to also take some heart that there is a trend. There is a trend here, irrespective of how inadequate and how much more urgency needs to happen.
And before I come to Patricia and François, I would ask you maybe just to layer into focus which will be your final remarks, I think, given the clock. We have a number of critical moments on the calendar over the next few years, whether it's the Global Climate Action Summit in California, the Secretary General's Summit a year hence, obviously the Conference of Parties, and other fora. If you can reflect on what do you think are the most critical moments that we need to focus on as a community in terms of being able to focus that energy away from the announcement fatigue and toward action. Patricia, to you.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I think we really need to work a lot on communicating the story, and I fully agree with Brian in saying there is a trend, and the fact that today we have 174 ratifications of the Paris Agreement is also a continuation of the trend that he was talking about. But we forget, people just take it then as something that is given for granted, and we don't manage to give it the relevance that it really has, and what it means to today, so shortly after the Paris Agreement, only 2 years and something, and 2 months, we already have 174 countries. Now, in that regard, we do need to make use of the different milestones that we will have in the coming months regarding the process. We have, of course, as I was mentioning, the COP in Poland this year. We will have an additional negotiating session somewhere either August or September, which is in order to try to make sure that we will have the work done, the homework done by December. But we will have in September also the California Summit, and those are extraordinary moments to use in order to really make this communication about what is really happening and the connection between the real world, what you all are doing, and what needs to be done in the countries. And for next year, we have also of course, we will have the COP, that's every year. And then we will have the summit by the Secretary General on climate change again, which we feel it's going to be an incredible moment for us to prepare for the 2020 conference where we need to start seeing a revision of the national plans by countries in order to close the gap in emissions reduction that is needed. So yeah, lots of work to be done, lots of moments to be seized in order to advance our agenda. And thank you for organizing this.
Thank you. And François, I think the last few words will be yours.
Oh, thank you very much. No,
Please
no
go ahead.
pressure. You asked me about the fact that development and climate are intrinsically connected, and I believe it's very true. Amina Mohamed already spoke about it, so I will be very brief. What I can say based on my personal experience here at the UN, is that as a permanent member of the Security Council, I see that link between development and climate change literally every day. The images and first-hand stories of tragedy and horror remind me and should remind us all why sustainable development is vital to us as human beings and as a society. The UN Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs, in which climate change is a key element, are a critical step that I see companies and investors embracing. And to make a long story short, there is a quiet revolution happening here at the UN with the SDGs. And of course, the challenge is to make sure that we together spread the word and make sure that this revolution of the SDGs is embraced by the real world, by you, by the investors and the companies. As others have said before, there will be no sustainable development if climate change is not tackled. For instance, we cannot meet the goals related to food security, health, or cities if we fail to deliver on climate change. Droughts, erosion, floods, disease, these are factors of climate change and factors of poverty, famine, and war. Alongside the COP21, 70 ad hoc coalitions gathering companies, investors, government, NGOs, and other non-state actors were formed to implement the Paris Accord, thus covering the 17 SDGs. For example, the African Clean Energy Corridor and the International Solar Alliance decided to tackle the issue of affordable and clean energy, SDG 7. Another example is the Blue Goals Initiative and the Global Resilience Partnership decided to tackle zero hunger, SDG number 2. I also want to point out the extraordinary innovation, economic and investment opportunities for development that many have begun to seize as they relate to the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. So, to conclude, I would say that we are on the journey towards a low-carbon world, but we need to understand the urgency for action at a very large scale. The Paris Accord and the UN SDGs provide us with a common framework and a roadmap opening the avenue to unprecedented opportunities for innovation, collaboration, and action. So, as President Macron would say, en marche, let's get moving. Merci.
Thank you. That's a perfect line on which to conclude. Join me in thanking our panelists. Thank you very much.